I find that fascinating because I do think that from the outside, you look at the Aces, you say, yeah, well, you were focused on this core four, and you got 2 titles out of this core four. You've got A'ja Wilson, she's a 3-time MVP. And the Liberty, at this juncture, they made these signings, they made these changes, they rely on more than that. And that is, of course, again, yes, the focus of a team wanting to come back against the team that beat them, but it also just kind of speaks to what Las Vegas didn't do to revamp this look and play differently this year, knowing that the competition was getting steeper. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's edition of The Late Sub. I am your host, Claire Watkins. It is Thursday, October 3rd, and we are diving in. We're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into the Game 2 of the WNBA semifinals. We've got a lot of kind of post-mortems coming out of these shifts in these series. We've got some big teams we might be saying goodbye to this weekend. I wanted to dive in both into what happened in these games and what these head coaches had to say about it, because we're seeing some pretty serious chatter about sort of what this means for the arc of the season. Then we're going to do a little NWSL weekend preview where we have a lot of clinching scenarios and possibly a Shield, which now has a handle, by the way, on the line. So let's dig in. All right. One of the beautiful benefits of getting to do 2 of these episodes a week is getting to do a little bit of a deeper dive into the big moments in women's sports. And I think obviously this week, that is the WNBA playoffs. It feels like a lot of the bandwidth has been taken up by this semifinal series, blockbuster teams, blockbuster performances. That was true Tuesday night when we saw our Game 2s. Nothing has changed, though we are getting to the point where we are about to possibly say goodbye to some of the major performers of the season. Again, this postseason is so short, it's fast and furious, and things can go wrong very quickly. I am obviously alluding to the fact that the Las Vegas Aces are on the brink of elimination. They're the first reigning champions to ever fall into a 2-game deficit in a WNBA playoff series. And if they want to come back, this is a best of 5, they'd have to win 3 games in a row. They would be the first WNBA team to ever come back from a 2-0 deficit in a best of 5 playoff series. The Liberty got their second win of the semifinals on Tuesday. It was another close game. It was just a 4-point win. Sabrina Ionescu plays very well. You see the Aces kind of come back in the fourth quarter after having some trouble earlier to get A'ja Wilson involved. It was a good game. I am interested both in the small and the big of this one, because frankly, what I saw in this game was an interesting kind of game plan shift by the Aces. It almost worked. They actually made some strides, some serious strides in how they were playing as a whole team. They had some trouble maybe getting their guards involved as much as they would have liked in that first game. It looked like the guards were much more involved in this game. Then the question falls onto how do you get Wilson involved? But the Liberty just kind of played their guts out and they got a win. And this is what happens. Again, it's so fast in these WNBA semifinals. 2 games where the other opponent brings it just a little bit more than you do, and you're staring at having to make history to advance. So I want to talk about the game itself. And I'm going to talk about it maybe in the more broad strokes, because I think with the playoffs, like I said, it's very fast and furious, and you do see adjustments, but did the adjustments work? Not enough to get the win, right? But also after the game, the Aces head coach Becky Hammon gave some comments that felt like a mixture of obviously what she saw happening in this game, what she thinks might be necessary to be able to, again, make history to pull out of the semifinal, but also vaguely some moments of that feels a little bit more like a postmortem to the season before the postseason is even over. Whenever you get that energy from a coach, I think it's worth noting, because that is sort of the conduit from what you're seeing in the locker room. We also saw Becky Hammon very animated on the sideline in this game. She really laid into like Kelsey Plum individually. She had some choice words for the entire team as well. And she had some interesting things to say about kind of where she saw both what the Aces were doing in executing their own game plan and what they saw from New York, what actually happened in this game. So we saw a starting 5 lineup change for the Aces. They put Alicia Clark into the starting 5 rather than Kia Stokes. Small ball. They went small ball. They basically had to make the call that rather than using the length of Kia Stokes, but she's not an offensive contributor, you need the points, right? You just need the points to keep up, hit them from the perimeter, and then try to get Wilson involved as much as you possibly can. Kia Stokes has actually leave the game with a concussion in this game later in the game, so they're probably going to be without her for this Game 3, this deciding Game 3. And they clearly felt like they needed to get the guards going. And that actually worked. We saw the Aces look a lot sharper in certain aspects of the game in this Game 2. They started out shooting better. They shot almost 60% in the first quarter. They did still struggle with New York's length. You saw Jonquel Jones and Breanna Stewart very much tuned in on trying to keep A'ja Wilson quiet. And then because of that, A'ja Wilson, you saw her kind of take herself out of plays in the offense to try to build space for her teammates. But that also meant that you weren't getting the ball to your unanimous MVP. New York has just provided so many questions of the Aces offense that the Aces have been able to answer in spurts, but not consistently. It was a very physical game. I think I respect, like, all respect to the referees. I think they let a lot go and they also called a lot. And it was like a mixture of both where they were trying to let these players play playoff basketball. You don't want to over whistle it, but you also at some point do have to call things. And then those things seem like egregious called as compared to what you let go. And so I think that's a very difficult balance. 3-point shooting kept the Aces in it. They were shooting very nicely from the 3-point line, but New York was kind of getting everything out of everybody. We saw Courtney Vandersloot come into this game and have a really nice impact. It was 12 points off of the bench. As we talked about earlier in the week and also last week, they made that switch to have her coming off the bench rather than starting, to have Leonie Fibic starting in this game. Again, that length killing the Aces. And Vandersloot also, to her credit, great defensive game on Tuesday. She got like a sick block on Jackie Young. You don't see that a lot from Vandersloot. Vandersloot is not the tallest WNBA player in the world. But however, the physicality of the game did start to work against New York. The Aces were able to get Wilson a little bit more involved. You saw Asia Wilson start to heat up a little bit. She does finish this game with 24 points. It was like a quiet 24 points, if you can even call it that. And they chip away from the free throw line. So they do start to get some calls. You see the players kind of react to the physicality by being like, okay, we're going to go up for shots and we're going to get fouls called. They chip away from the free throw line, but it just wasn't quite enough. So looking at it in game from like game 1 to game 2, it's some of the same storylines that we've had with the Aces all season, where even I think Hammon alluded to this after the game, where they really struggled with their rotations at the beginning of the season, working Chelsea Gray back into the starting 5. They don't have the depth. They find that edge to make this push all the way to the 4th seed after the Olympics. And now they look fatigued again, and they look a little bit out of ideas again. On the flip side, New York is playing their butts off. And the Aces haven't been able to defeat this year's version of New York once this season. This is a problem team for the Aces. And so I think you can obviously diagnose kind of the Aces issues, but you also just have to say this is just a bad matchup for them. The New York came into this season with the intention of winning this exact series. And that amount of work is also paying off. They've got length advantages. They're focusing on shutting down the unanimous MVP. They're shutting Wilson down. Wilson's going to get hers, though, right? A player that good is going to get those 24 points. But she also has to rely on her teammates to be able to get those points that she can't. You're not necessarily seeing that. And Vegas is just sort of paying the piper for their lack of depth post-Olympic break going into this three-peat run, right? But Hammon, after this game, had some comments that I think everyone sort of latched onto, because when you talk to a coach in a series like this, you have to understand that they're giving you their honest answer, but also they have a very specific job, and it's to focus on their team, not on the other team. You don't want to go so far as to just be like, this other team's better than us without the series being over, right? So she's going to have this mix of, she wants to galvanize her team, encourage her team, take her team to task. But what that looked like for Hammon after this game was something, you look at the whole statement and you think she's already thinking about next year a tiny bit, or this year as a whole, right? And she's coming to some conclusions in the heat of the moment. So this is the whole quote that I thought was very interesting for Becky Hammon. So she says, quite frankly, we haven't had the edge all year. Now, we found it the last month. I feel we've gained a lot of ground, but the feel was different from the jump. And this is why three-peating is hard. Let's be real. The whole league has been pissed off for the last 8 months, and my players are in commercials and this and that and being freaking celebrities, and you get distracted. That's why it's hard, because human nature is distracting. Conversely, and this is, I thought, an interesting anecdote, so people might know that Becky Hammon was an assistant coach for NBA San Antonio Spurs for a number of years before taking the Aces job. She says, you think about the Spurs. I do all the time. I know you know the Spurs with the Miami Heat. They lose an absolute heartbreaker off a basic thing, offensive rebound kick out three. They should have walked away with the title that year. The next year, they came back with so much drive, so much discipline, so much focus that there was no way someone was beating them in 2014. That ball was popping. They took a huge loss. She flips it back to this analogy back to this year. She goes, the Liberty took a huge loss last year. I liken it to that a little bit. They had it. They felt like they had it, and we walked away from it. We walked away with it. I did think we were the better team, but we were dealt a really freaking tough hand last year in the finals, losing Chelsea and Kia. I'm sure they felt like something was stolen a little bit at the end of the day. In 2 years, we've won here one time, game 4. Other than that, they've kicked her off. So that game 4 was obviously very important. That was the game 4 that the Aces won the championship on last year. But she makes a fair point, I think, in ways. I always get really interested when a coach starts talking about the off the court stuff. I always think, I'm like, yes, it is distracting. Maybe it's just more things on the books. I think three-peating is very difficult. Again, you don't have that singular focus of coming back and getting revenge once you've been on the top of the mountain so long. But she also said when you get into the nitty-gritty of the game, she says the team gave up too many layups and sort of framed this loss as aces versus aces. So she's doing two things at once here. She's talking about the larger arc of the season as if it was perhaps a failure, at least going into this postseason. They weren't able to get that edge. But she's also positioning this as something that the Aces can get themselves out of because they're playing against themselves, the execution of what should be a winning game plan. And so it does feel like, as we said, that 2-hole in a best of 5 series is very difficult to get out of. And it feels like Hammon is already sort of thinking about the larger arc of the season in a way that is probably also already going into sort of next year, what she's thinking on next year. And I find that fascinating because I do think that from the outside, you look at the Aces, you say, yeah, well, you were focused on this core 4 and you got 2 titles out of this core 4. You've got A'ja Wilson, she's a 3-time MVP. And the Liberty at this juncture, they made these signings, they made these changes, they rely on more than that. And that is, of course, again, yes, the focus of a team wanting to come back against the team that beat them. But it also just kind of speaks to what Las Vegas didn't do to revamp this look and play differently this year, knowing that the competition was getting steeper. So outside perspective isn't Hammon's job. It's her job to kind of diagnose her own team, talk about what didn't work, and try to galvanize them again into getting something out of this third game, which I think they will. I do not think this is going to be a sweep. I think they are going to win on Friday. I think Sunday is the big question. But even if they do, even if the Aces make history and they come right back, I think we're looking at changes for next year, whether it's making changes to the bench depth, whether it's differences in even that starting 5 and figuring out what actually works for them, and getting Wilson some help, some taller, some bigs that can also score. They just haven't had that this year. And so I think that looking into an expansion year, and I think you always have to gauge this into an expansion year because everything changes when there's expansion in my experience. I think you're going to see some changes for the Aces regardless of what happens. And then just a quick note on the other series, which I also really enjoy. And this is actually kind of full circle to Hammon's comments, but Minnesota ties things up with Connecticut. Another very good game, very defensive, very physical. Connecticut does the thing that they do. They muck things up. They make it so hard to play offense. And then this game, rather than not being able to get through it, Minnesota ups their level, especially in the second half. They up the tempo. They get looks for their executing players. Courtney Williams plays very, very well. She's kind of this combo guard for Minnesota. They get Nafisa Collier better looks. This is this battle between two teams, one team that wants to slow it down and one team that wants to speed it up. And you're watching in the first game, you see Connecticut successfully offset Minnesota. And then the second game, you see Minnesota successfully offset Connecticut. I think this one could go to 5. I've really enjoyed this series. But I also just think that this goes back to what I was talking about with Hammon and sort of this trust in making those right moves to get to a title. Now, you don't want to bail out for a win now, but it does strike me that both of these teams, Connecticut and Minnesota, made some pretty aggressive midseason moves. You had the Sun make a pretty aggressive move, and especially when you think about the draft pick that they give up for Marina Mabry. That was a win now move. They say, we have this window specifically with Alyssa Thomas and DeWanna Bonner, and we want to get something out of it. They haven't won a title together. They moved for Mabry. They look like a different team. Minnesota, to their credit, also made a midseason move. They signed Maisha Hines-Allen out of Washington, and they sent some like good prospects out to Washington to get Maisha Hines-Allen. Hines-Allen was huge in this second game, getting that presence both on the defense and offensive side in the paint, which is so difficult to do against the length of Connecticut. Aggressive moves, trusting that you have the right pieces and you just need to make that kind of final adjustment to get over the top. Because like I said, this semifinals, again, pre-expansion, huge, really, really difficult to get through with the talent concentration that they have this year that I just simply do not believe is always going to be true when you look at 2025 and 2026 with the aggressive expansion that the WNBA is about to go into. Which leads me to maybe my thesis about this semifinal series, which is not dissimilar to where the Aces are at right now, which is I want to look at the Lynx maybe specifically, but I think to a lesser extent Connecticut. I think that with both of these programs, you see coaches and general managers get a chance to make adjustments, and they're trusted by the owners of their teams. You've seen Stephanie White. After letting go of Kurt Miller, that kind of relationship had reached its end. They bring Stephanie White in. You've seen those adjustments. You've seen the correct assessment of what Connecticut needs, and it is that outside shooting. And does it mean they're going to beat the Lynx every time? No. I mean, again, this is that push-pull of what Connecticut wants to do versus what Minnesota wants to do, and they're two very good teams. But Connecticut is better equipped now than they probably have ever been to try to make a run at this title. It might just be the wrong gear. You look at the same thing with the Lynx. I want to go back to Cheryl Reeve, who has taken a lot of criticism, not only this season, but in seasons in the past. I mean, she went through hell as the coach of the USA basketball team this year with some people with some criticisms about how she did her rotations and how the committee picked that roster. But Cheryl Reeve is someone who, you look at her exit interviews in the last couple of years, and the Lynx have had a down period. This is not a foregone conclusion that they're in this position right now. She has been very open when she doesn't think that the group is working. She's had criticism for having certain players signed and then benching those players on big contracts. In the exit interviews, she'll very openly say, she says, this wasn't the group. They weren't doing what I wanted them to do. We needed to figure out who our bench players were, and we needed to figure out our rotations, once kind of determining that some of these players weren't the right fit, and then we move on. This is the apex of that. They sign really, really good players off of the free agency market. Again, you talk about Courtney Williams, Alana Smith. The development of Kayla McBride has been wonderful to see. You see Natisha Heidemann. You're seeing Bridget Carlton is another fabulous pickup for them over time. And now they're playing exactly like Reeve wants them to play. And that's what is putting them in this position to fight to play in the finals for the first time in a while. So I am curious, kind of, you look at these teams and their different life cycles and going into a chaos agent like an expansion year. Just interesting to see with all four of these teams, because like I said, we might be saying goodbye between now and our next episode. We might be saying goodbye to two really, really good WNBA teams. I don't know which ones they'll be. But then we move into the uncertain future of the expansion year, and you have to take those comments by a coach seriously. So I think the Aces are going to give Hammon a certain amount of leeway to make the changes that she needs to make. And obviously you see kind of what that looks like when you bet correctly on a coach. I also just want to give kind of that final note on, this is what happens when you have the right coaching hire and you trust that coaching hire with how cutthroat the business has been in the WNBA in the last week. We've seen a number of coaches let go, Kurt Miller and Teresa Weatherspoon, and most recently Tanisha Wright in Atlanta. Right now, there are 4 teams that need coaches, if you're including Golden State. You gotta make the right hires, and you gotta trust the right people, and it leads you as far as it possibly can go. So I just have thought these series have been very fascinating, and I'm just really enjoying. I've said this like a million times in this episode, but this is just so true in the NWSL. And I found it to be true in the WNBA as well. I just hope everyone is really enjoying the concentration of talent at the top, because things are about to change in a very serious way for the better, but it's going to be different. So I really hope people are enjoying these semifinals. Now, switching over to NWSL, we're going to do a little preview for this NWSL weekend because there is a lot going on. Clinching scenarios are pretty intense. So we're getting close to some very basic wins, but also the math is getting very interesting to see who are getting some of these final playoff spots. So shout out to Allison Gale, very good data viz on Twitter. You can follow her on Twitter at @Gale137. She put together all of the clinching scenarios for this weekend. Wanted to run through these. So Orlando Pride can clinch the Shield if they win, and you win the league. They're playing the Washington Spirit. That's why it happens. If they do beat the Spirit, 6-point swing between 1 and 2, they can win the Shield. Washington Spirit can clinch quarterfinal hosting with a win or a draw against Orlando, or a separate San Diego win or draw. Gotham clinches quarterfinal hosting with a win plus a San Diego win or draw, or a draw and a San Diego win. So a lot of these actually hinge on the San Diego result, which actually makes a lot of sense. Kansas City can clinch hosting with a win plus a San Diego win or draw. North Carolina is very, very close to clinching playoffs. They can win and they're in the playoffs, or a Kansas City win would put them in the playoffs. A draw plus a Utah win or draw, a draw plus a Kansas City draw, or a Kansas City draw plus a Utah win. So we're nearing North Carolina playoffs. That's happening. Utah Royals are eliminated from playoff contention with a loss, or a draw and a Bay win or draw, are eliminated with a loss or a draw. So a fail to win. Houston, they are out. And the Reign are eliminated with a Reign loss, Chicago win or draw plus Bay win plus Portland win, a draw plus Chicago win plus Bay win plus Portland win, or a Reign loss, a Chicago win or draw, a Louisville win, a Bay win, and a Portland draw. So we're beginning to see some endings here. We're going to see some teams eliminated. We're going to see some teams clinch. It's going to come down to the final 3 spots, as I think we knew. There's only 4 games left in the season. We're in crunch time. I like the Pride actually to win this game, and it's nothing against Washington at all. I just think Washington's injury report is getting a little bit overwhelming. The Pride are going to be at home. They had a fabulous win last week, and you look at sort of what the Spirit are missing. This is looking back at last week's availability report. You obviously have the season-ending injuries to someone like Croy Bethune and a Halferty, and then they had Casey Kruger out, Chloe Ricketts out, Trinity Rodman out, Ule Sarr out, Lena Solano was out with a suspension, so she'll be back. They're missing a lot of key contributors, and I feel bad for the Spirit because they've had such wonderful stretches of play this year, and I just wonder if maybe you always have one team that just gets crushed by the injury bug. And I do fear that it is them this year. Other matchups that intrigue me, I do think Gotham versus Bay FC has major implications for the Bay if they want to stay above the playoff line. Gotham is coming off a short week. They had a Champions Cup match this week, but I've been very impressed with Gotham's roster rotation. I think the way they've not only been able to integrate their new stars and give those stars a rest this week, but just sort of lean on players like Delaney Sheehan, Neely Martin, Mandy Freeman had a very good game this midweek in the Champions Cup. The Cece Kaiser pickup was so savvy. Like Gotham looked to me like they're just a modern football club, man. They are well equipped to do these rotations for cup ties versus what they have to do for regular season. I think they're going to bring it. The Bay is going to have their hands full, and I think strength of schedule is going to be a major factor going into the last couple of games of the season. And then the other thought I have, and this goes back into my premise on Bay maybe versus Louisville for sitting above the playoff line once we get to the end of the season. Right now, like I said, North Carolina is about to clinch, right? There's 3 spots left. I'm going to bookmark one of those spots for Portland. I think Portland is going to finish above the playoff line. If they don't get Sophia Smith back, maybe that's a question mark, but I just think Portland, it's going to happen, right? So then you've got realistically maybe the Bay, Chicago, and Louisville fighting for those last 2 spots. I gave my pitch for the Bay earlier this week, but here is maybe my counterpoint for Louisville, which is that Louisville has, they're outside the looking in terms of the playoff line right now, but they've achieved that with a 0 goal differential, which is pretty impressive. If they chip away at the point gap, that goal differential would put them above every team south of North Carolina in 5th. There isn't a single other team below North Carolina in the standings with a non-negative goal differential except for Racing Louisville. Racing Louisville is like the balanced team. They draw games, they score goals, but they also concede them. They're at 30 goals scored and 30 goals conceded. They've got a bit of a gauntlet to close the season. They have to play Kansas City this week, then Washington, then Portland, and then San Diego. That's tough because San Diego's a tough out no matter what. San Diego, I don't believe, is going to be an easy out going into the rest of the season. And what's killing Louisville, the thing that I say make up the point gap and you're in a really good position, but what's been their struggle this season so far is they don't win games. The reason why there are teams with worse goal differentials than them above them in the table is because a team like Chicago, for example, or a team like the Bay has simply won more than Louisville has. And I think that's disappointing. I think Louisville should think to themselves, okay, we are the most balanced team out of a number of these more mercurial teams, right? Maybe not counting Portland, but looking at that sort of close dereliction between them and Chicago and the Bay. They're like, we are more consistent. We have a more consistent lineup. We have more consistent goal scorers. We are a steady team. We play to the level of our competition. But if you're not winning games, then those other teams who are maybe hotter for a little bit part of the season or maybe slide a little bit more, they're above you. So I like Louisville, but I do think that that's a major issue. And so I'm very, very curious to see if they're able to get any sort of points out of Kansas City this weekend, because I think that would go a long way. But it should be a great weekend. Again, tune in, y'all. I know that the WNBA is in the postseason, and it feels like a bigger deal, but we are in the home stretch of the NWSL season before playoff starts. And this is going to be a fabulous postseason for the NWSL because so many of these teams are so good. But yeah, check into this final run because it's going to be wild. And then real quick before we go, I want to just kind of do a shout out to the other thing that I've just been seeing a lot of this week. And I'm really, really excited I am excited for college basketball to come back. Everyone's back on campus. Everyone's training again. You had the optional workouts going. I think we're going to start seeing more formal workouts, more formal media availability this week and next. And I just have so many questions going into the college basketball season that I'm not going to answer any of them today, but here's kind of what I'm thinking about. And I'm curious what other people are excited for the college basketball season. I think obviously you look at South Carolina and just wondering what this new era of South Carolina is going to look like post Camila Cardoso, carrying such high expectations going into this year. I'm curious to see how last year's just sort of fantastic freshmen handle, avoiding the sophomore slump. Hannah Hidalgo, Malaysia Fulwiley, Juju Watkins, Kiki Rice. What do these players look like in year 2? The Big Ten realigned, where you do have players like Rice and Watkins come in to become the superstars post Caitlin Clark. Big Ten feels very, very different, not only because of the massive hole that Caitlin Clark leaves in terms of notoriety, but also this new alignment where some of the best teams, the people competing for trophies in the Big Ten are going to be those West Coast teams often and most likely. I'm very curious about how things look for Stanford in general, joining the ACC. And then also, I just think the main storyline here is UConn. I think if if it wasn't any other year, it's this year, right? And Paige Bueckers has a lot of pressure on her shoulders because this is her last chance to win a national championship at UConn, which, as we know, has become sort of a rite of passage and a very open ambition for many of those players. I read a wonderful piece about Bueckers in The Ringer today, where they quote Gino Auriemma talking about Paige, and Gino says, if for whatever reason we don't win a national championship this year, Paige is going to feel like she's the best player to ever play at Connecticut that didn't win a national championship. And if that is not a cool ethos for the college basketball season, I don't know what is. So those are all of my questions, and we'll dig into maybe answering those a little bit when we get a little bit closer to tip off. But just wanted to say I'm very excited. We're seeing the turn of the seasons, got a little bit of a chill in the air. We're moving into autumn, and I cannot wait to dive into college basketball once we've got these pro leagues done. So that has been today's edition of The Late Sub. I am your host, Claire Watkins. Shout out to producer extraordinaire Parker Fenton. I hope you guys are enjoying the doubling up cadence of 2 a week. I think it gives us a chance to dive into more interesting things. Have very much enjoyed these WNBA playoffs. Can't wait for this run-in for NWSL. And then we've got a lot of winter sports coming down the pike. So stick with us. We'll talk to y'all next week.